Okay, we're gonna wait for the last couple people to join in here before we get going on our optimizing downwind multi-hull sailing. We'll give it about another 10 or 15 seconds and then we'll get underway here. As everyone kind of comes in, we ask you to just make sure that you are on mute. Again, cameras are off. Hopefully you all have a cocktail or some food ready to get a good talk in here. And we're gonna get rolling right into it. Matt, well, we'll start right about now. So I'd like to welcome everyone tonight to the Optimizing Downwind Multi-Hull Sailing presentation. I'm Alan Terhune. I'm at the North Sails Loft here in Annapolis. I'm going to help moderate the discussion tonight. We have three awesome presenters here to give you guys a good talk on downwind sailing on your multi-hull. So I want to introduce everybody first. So JB Braun, who's the head of design and engineering here at North Sails, from America's Cup to the most high-performing things to 3DI sails, he's the go-to guy. JB, are you with us?
Yep, I'm here. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you. We have Brad White, who's also in the Marblehead office, and when it comes from beach cats to cruising cats, everything in between, he'll be able to help us out with that. Brad, are you with us?
Yes, I am, Alan. Thank you very much.
And last, but certainly not least, the guy who really put this whole presentation together, and someone who I've known probably since we were both teenagers in middle school. But he's sailed everything from TF10s to Extreme 40s to Marstrom 32s, who's also at the Marblehead Loft, Stan Schreyer.
Thanks, thank you, Alan. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. So Stan, why don't you take us into what we're going to talk tonight and kick us off?
I want to start by thanking Alan and Brad and JB for their help with this talk. And again, thank you everybody for viewing. We wish we were doing this on a dock or at a yacht club, but this is what we have right now. So our outline for tonight, we're going to talk a lot about the importance of fundamentals for our downwind sailing. And we're going to talk about how wind speed may affect our tactical decisions when we're sailing downwind on the beat. And we're going to be doing that within the context of a lot of the importance of fundamentals. And then we're going to wrap it up with talking about some specific tactical points in different segments of the downwind leg. And we've broken up our racing fundamentals into three major categories: boat speed, boat handling, and tactics. And we're going to start with the boat speed category. And we've broken that up into a couple subcategories also, things that are important to make sure your boat's going fast. They include hull prep, rigging prep, sail preparation, and sail selection. And we'll stop right there and go out to this picture that we have. That's one that JB, our sail designer, gave us. That illustrates really well turbulence going over the deck and the sails of a boat, and I'll turn it over to JB to explain a little bit more about that.
Great, Stan. Thanks very much. I'm not so sure that that picture shows a whole lot, just looking at it, unless it's explained a little bit, but I'll get into that in a minute. But the one thing I wanted to start off about with multi-hulls, when you go down, most of the time, hull prep, we talk about hull preparation, and as a monohull sailor, and some multi-hulls, the hull does matter quite a bit. The polishing the hull, making sure it's clean and free of debris and that, and the same with the foils is paramount. And one of the things that we as sailors tend to focus on is hull preparation. And I think that's because the hull goes in the water, we can hear the water rushing on it, we can see the turbulence, we can see the wake, we can do all that, and it's very apparent that that's an important factor. But one of the, and that's an factor, the less drag you have in the water, the faster the boat can go. But the other half of that equation is aerodynamics, and it's one that's not easily understood, especially because you can't see it. If you could see the air flowing over, like the water over a hull, you'd be like, oh, I can optimize that. I know what I can do. So this picture on the right is a TF10 in one of the downwind studies that we've worked on. And and there's a trimaran hull there with the platform and the main and the jib, or gennaker, and that's colored by the pressure, the amount of air pressure on the sail. And then the sort of blobs that you see around the hull and the bottom of the main and the top of the main are zones of stagnant air. So we develop these little iso surfaces that are quantified by, say, wind that's flowing under 1 knot of wind speed. And then we develop these surfaces so we can visualize what's happening to the sails. And in this particular instant, it's in a multi-hull, we have the ability to trim the sails differently than a monohull, mainly the sheeting angle. So we can slide the sheeting and the traveler at a further degree angle to leeward than you can with a monohull, and that provides some added opportunities for trimming the sails. And in this case here, the main is fairly optimally trimmed. However, you'll notice the bottom of the main has a big area of turbulence or stagnation or stall. But also the top of the main does too. If you look at the top leach, I don't know, Al, if you can, I'm putting the cursor on it, but in the top leach of the main, you have the zone that's also stalling. And one of the reasons for that is the Genoa is sitting in front of the main, and it actually changes the onset flow onto the mainsail. Through the body of the sail is nicely trimmed, but then the top would want to magically be open more. So you'd want to actually twist the top of the main in this case if you could. But a lot of times twisting the top of the main more creates inefficiencies in the middle. So you can't, and that's the challenge that we have as sailors, is to kind of take and figure out how to optimally satisfy this. You'll notice in a lot of more modern boats, what we're trying to do is create an end plate with the sails. So that's stopping these vortices from forming on the edges of the sails and basically creating turbulence. And here in the bottom of the sail, we have a small end plate that's on the deck, but we would be able to decrease the amount of drag right there if we could end plate that all the way to the trampoline. And it is a big factor in the efficiency of these sails. And in multi-hulls, as the wind speed increases, one of the big factors that we are trying to reduce is the aerodynamic drag. So this has the effect, end plating this has the effect of decreasing the drag.
Hey, JP, a quick question. Yeah. Have you guys looked at putting an end plate sort of plate on the head of the main, on the head of the square top main, very similar to what's being done on, jet wings now, which saves a tremendous amount of fuel? And
there's been a lot of that type of research done, but the practicalities of it is tough to implement, not only in weight, but in the functionality of the apparent wind. So it ends up, creating possibly a more efficient vertical lift distribution, but the penalty of it is also a factor. So it hasn't been executed in a manner. But that's could be something to look at.
So JB and Stan, in looking at this, photo here, so when you're actually on the boat, real life application, what are signs that the two of you, you've designed this sail, Stan, you're out on the water using the sail, and now you're on the boat. What are things that you're looking at that indicates these drag situations or how to trim these sails properly? And, I'll let both of you jump in here, but, now in actual practical use, what are you looking for?
The good old fashioned telltale is still really probably our best tool, right?
Yep. Yeah. And in this case, what you'd see in the upper leach, you'd see the flickering of the telltales at those top battens. And that really is the best way to do it. On the leeward side of the bottom of the main, you also telltales. Because in these stagnation zones, the wind will be swirling and won't be streaming back. So the telltale will respond to that. And that's still really for getting out on the water and sailing, that's the best technique to understand what the flow's doing.
right now.
I do think also trial and error is really important, because different sails are going to behave differently, and we're not all going to be able to have these drawings that are going to tell us how to trim the sails. So you got to go out and you got to practice and you got to speed test and look up at the sails and and just go with your empirical knowledge about, okay, well, when the sail looks like this and this breeze strength, that's fast, or that was slow. We don't want to make it look that way. I mean, and Brad, you can speak to how important time in the boat is for your boat handling and your sail trim.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's there's no doubt about it. One of the first catamaran experiences I had was a buddy of mine who just sailed this Hobie Cat all the time, and he went to one regatta, and good God, he won the thing. He'd never really raced before, but he won the regatta. The guy just spent hours and hours and hours out on his boat, and he knew how to tack it, and he knew how to jibe it, and he basically knew how to get it around the race course. He wasn't by any means a really good racer, but that was just time in the boat, plain old time in the boat. He knew how to make the boat go fast, which was really, really important.
So I want to ask you guys two more questions, kind of keep this going. So I want to come to this sail selection. So obviously, there's two types of monohulls, right? There's high performance, high speed monohulls, which we've talking about with, Marsham 32s, America's Cup boats, that type of thing, tornadoes, or, your cruising cat that you have down, you're going to the BVI and you're going to drink a beer and go sailing. So, in both of those cases, what are the sail selections for going downwind that we're talking about here that you think about or that are, points that are different than, say, if you have a monohull?
Well, there certainly are lots of options. Most of the people I deal with, the cruising kind of guys, pretty much to the top of their list comes durability, which lends you toward the woven fabrics or the not necessarily the hybrid carbons and aramids. The 3DI products are adding a tremendous amount of durability to the inventories that they can get, but that's where it starts. And as for downwind sails, we're treating the heavier Lagoon 42s and those types of cats and trimarans more like a monohull, where the sails are a little bit bigger and rounder. They're not the high-speed tweeners and sails like that code 55 and 65. But the racing cats are a different animal, and that's JB and Stan's expertise. Jump in there.
Yeah, I think, Brad, you're right. The big thing that we've seen recently in the past 10 years is boats that sail faster than the wind, meaning their boat speed is at multiples of the true wind speed. And when that happens, the whole sail selection and sail trim changes, because the boats their need for sail power has changed, meaning they're sailing at much tighter apparent wind angles and much higher apparent wind speeds. And what we end up doing is having downwind sails on these boats that sail faster than the wind that look more like a standard upwind sail. So we're not using or designing spinnakers anymore. We're designing like upwind Genoas that are designed for the downwind onset flow. And Stan, maybe this is some of the.
So before we we have a couple of questions here that we've gotten from our viewers that I want to throw to you guys before we move on to this next portion here, which I think is really important. So one of them is, which telltales, Stan, when you're talking about telltales before, were you talking about leech telltales or luff telltales, and which ones do you think are more important in this trim application?
Both. You got to look at the telltales that are on the panels of the sail as well as the ones on the leech.
Got it.
And if you're not sure where to put them, code it.
So
everywhere.
I would take that one further, you guys. I would say that forget two sails. You have one wing. You've got a leading edge, which is the luff of your headsail, whether it's an asymmetric or a small jib. And you've got the trailing edge, which is the mainsail. So you need to look at the two of them. And of course, like on a monohull, it's all about balancing them out and making as much of your sales, as much of both of your sales, your wholesale plan, as efficient as possible. And right now, the best indicator we have is the telltales, and you can put them anywhere you want. And as you were saying earlier, Stan, you get to the empirical evidence, and that's by sailing, spending time in the boat. And you know how the telltales look when your boat is really ripping along, it's in the groove. You also know what the telltales look like when you're all slowed down.
Yeah. And Brad, if I was going to quantify where, as a sail designer and a sailor, what I look at, number one would be the entry especially of the jib. So you want to make sure that that's consistent and consistent with the onset flow. Is there a velocity gradient? Is there wind shear? You know, is the top of the sail luffing more than the bottom? So trying to balance that out. So telltales on the luff of the jib are critical. The other telltale on the jib that is super critical is the upper leach. When you're sailing upwind especially, you don't want the upper leach of the jib to stall. As soon as that telltale starts to stall, the whole pressure, you're creating all this extra drag. So you have the luff of the jib and the upper leach of the jib. And then the third one would be the upper leach of the main. So I would, you know, in that category, the luff of the jib, the leach of the jib, and then the leach of the main. If you're interested, like in that little diagram I had, you would put telltales in the foot of the main to understand what's happening there. But I'm not, without end plating or without doing, you know, more fancy things, that's harder to trim out of the sail.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the questions we had is just a brief, you know, give us a 10-second, probably 30, explanation of exactly what you mean by end plating, because there's a few folks who've asked, they're a little confused.
Yeah, so end
I don't know if we can show it here on this.
Basically taking the foot of the sail and creating a boundary that doesn't allow the air to escape. The air can enter on the luff of the sail, and the only place the air can escape the surface of the sail is the leach. So you have what's an end plate. Now, the deck of a boat could be considered an end plate. In these boats on the right, and you see, there's no end plate. So there's no end plating there unless you had some type of deck that was there. In the last couple America's Cup, you see that we focused a lot on end plating. And in fact, in the with the AC 75s in San Francisco, the whole boat was designed around end plating the main and the jib. So the structure, the whole integration of the system and the sails were designed to end plate. So we felt extremely, and you know, it's something that you can't feel on the water. It's like you don't go out and you say, oh, the boat's end plated, it's going a knot faster. But when you test it aerodynamically and you look at how much more efficient it is, it scientifically it's better. So
it's not that easy to see, but on the picture on the right, those GC32s, you can see 3 sets of telltales on the there you go, on the left of the sail, going 2 at the seams, and I think there's a 3rd set like up towards the top.
So now that we're on this slide, I want to bring the 3 of you back into this. So we have, you know, some high performance boats here, and, you know, what do you think right away? You're looking at this, you know, and I see boats going upwind, so behind them in the opposite direction, and these guys are trimmed in pretty hard going downwind, right? So if you two could talk us through a little bit, you know, why is that? I mean, why are the sails trimmed so hard? How do you end up here, and why do you do that?
Well, our high performance catamarans, really, they're so fast that the apparent wind going downwind isn't much further aft than it is going upwind. So the sails get pegged in, and you can see this with these 2 GC32 sails. They're probably almost getting those gennikers are getting wrapped around the leeward shroud almost, and they're trimmed as if they're going upwind. The picture on the left is a Tornado, and that's not as fast as the GC32s, but still the sails are trimmed in really tight on it. The main sail in that picture is probably a little bit over trimmed if we were to compare it to that TF10 slide that JB had, and that's my fault. I'm the one that's trimming that sail. But an important thing still to remember, though, is that easing and trimming the sails is important. The sails don't just get pegged in and stay in. So the sheets don't move far. The range when you're trimming a Jenniker on one of your high performance boats may be only 6 to 12 inches or something like that, depending on your change in velocity or direction. But those changes still need to get made. The trim still needs to be active on your mainsails and your Jennikers.
You cannot set it and forget it.
Can't
So-
set it and forget it.
No.
So one of the things that I'm in our practice session here, when we were getting this presentation ready, I'm gonna throw this question to JB. So you mentioned something that seemed counterintuitive to someone who doesn't sail boats like these boats at all, that I don't, but you guys do, where you're saying when you head up, you actually ease and you're trimming as you bear off. Maybe I misheard you, JB, but if you could, run through that maybe a little bit, I think that's an important part.
Yeah, Al, thanks. That's a good point, because it's so different to sail boats that sail faster than the wind, and it changes your whole outlook and what you think the sails are seeing. So here we're talking about sail trim, and when boats sail faster than the wind, what happens is, just imagine that there's 12 knots of wind, and these GCs, you're going 18 knots here. And if you could magically just sail dead downwind right here, just turn the boat and keep it going 18 knots, and you're sailing dead downwind, you would feel 6 knots of wind in your face coming directly on you or at you. So you would have wind coming, the boat would feel wind from the opposite direction that the wind is actually coming from. So along those lines, when you're sailing downwind, what ends up happening is as you bear the boat off, the apparent wind will actually go forward. And the wind speed, the apparent wind speed will decrease, but your wind angle will go forward. So as you bear off, a lot of times you'll want to trim the sails, and then you'll trim the sails to keep the optimum flow on the sails. Then as the apparent wind speed decreases, the boat will slow down. As the boat slows down, you'll have to head the boat up. Then the apparent wind, because the boat speed's going down, the apparent wind will start creeping forward. So then as you head up, you have to ease the sails out again. So it's like this little motion of bearing off and heading up, which is opposite of what you do on a monohull or boats that sail slower than the wind. I don't know if that totally makes sense, but it's something to get your head around for these boats that are truly faster than the breeze. It's a little different.
Time in the boat.
Time
Time in the boat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to kind of keep this moving, because otherwise we'll be here all night, and we all obviously want to hear you guys talk all night, but not so much. So let's talk about racing now a little bit. So now we're getting to our tactical priorities here. We're getting up to the windward mark. We're thinking about the downwind leg on these boats, where you may or may not ease the sails out, apparently. So, Stan, talk us through a little bit of this before we get into the video, and we'll talk through that as well.
I think that your major tactical priorities when you're sailing downwind in a fast catamaran are, one, staying fast all the time. And a big factor there is avoiding packs of boats. Sailing to the best velocity that you see is very important, and you'll prioritize that over what you think a wind shift is. Your lane management is very important, and it's really important to try to keep your maneuvers to the minimum. I mean, all those things are important in any type of racing, but when you're sailing boats that go 12 knots or more, 15 knots, 16 knots, when you make a mistake, when you make one of these mistakes, you don't slow down 0.2 of a knot, you slow down 3 or 4 knots sometimes. And so little mistakes, or what you think is going to be a little mistake, can translate into massive distance losses around the race course. And we have a video of a Marstrom 32 fleet rounding from they start on a reach, rounding onto their run. And this is a really good illustration of what happens for the boats that are able to get away from the packs and sail clean, and the boats that get stuck in the packs. And we can see this first place boat here. Obviously, it's easier to do that if you're in the lead. They're going to be sailing faster and lower than the rest of the boats immediately. You can see the second boat starts to break away, and then when we look back into this next group of boats, they get all clustered up with each other, and they're just making each other go slow. And you can see each of those boats sailing higher, where the boats that have clear air are able to sail faster and lower and break away from the fleet. And now at this point, you can see the one lead boat in that pack, they're able to break away and get down. And the whole rest of the fleet is just, they're all just bound up with each other.
Can you stop it right there, Alan? Can you stop it right there? Because I just want to point out, if you look at the wake of the lead boat, and you can see how hard he works to get the boat lower and lower and lower to the fleet. And that's just, I was, years ago, I was told that, you know, if you look behind yourself on your downwind legs and try to keep as low to the run line as you possibly can toward the next mark, you sail a much different and a much lower and much shorter course. If you look at the arc of the other boats above them, they're sailing so much further that this guy's just going to extend his lead by a significant amount by the time he gets to the leeward mark.
Now, obviously, when you're winning the race, it's easier to stay out of the packs. But when you're in the fleet, it's really important to try and find ways to sail away from the other boats. It's very, very important. Even if you think you may be going the wrong way, if you're going fast, that's your top priority.
So when looking at this, you know, obviously, you know, there's a lot going on here. So on boats like this, you know, what becomes a bigger priority? Wind speed, angles? I mean, what is your bigger priority in something like this?
Wind speed generally translate into better angles. So the answer is usually wind speed.
Copy that. Okay. So let's move on here. So you're coming up, we're going to go back to this, you know, you're kind of coming up to windward mark, and you're thinking about this run that's about to come up, and what the game plan for the entire run is. And, you know, in watching that video, they obviously happened pretty quick. So you got to be thinking about this a little bit. So, you know, Stan, what are some of the things that you prioritize when thinking about the downwind leg?
I mean, like in any boat, the plan for the run should be made. You should have a plan in your mind before you're getting to the windward mark. If you're rounding the windward mark and you don't know what your next move is going to be, then it's already too late. And I think a very, very important part of that, and this may sound silly, is that you got to know where the next mark is. And so when you're approaching the windward mark, there's a lot going on. You know, you're trying to figure out where the ley line is, trying to get ready for the spinnaker set if your boat has a spinnaker. Try not to hit other boats if you're in a pack of boats, but you gotta give yourself mental space to think about what you're going to be doing when you're exiting the windward mark. And that starts with knowing where the mark is, because the run could be skewed, or either because of a wind shift or because the race committee put the mark in the wrong spot. But that is knowing where the mark is going to tell you where the long tack is first. And that's going to answer your very first question when you round the windward mark, which is, are you going to want to jibe right away or not? JB or Brad, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes. Oh, Brad, did you?
No, go ahead, JB.
Yeah. Stan, that's a really good point of knowing where the mark is and knowing the long leg. Generally speaking, unless there's nothing else is mattering, you'd take the long jibe first because you don't know what's happening. I think in these higher speed multi-hulls, Stan alluded to it, that pressure is king. So you'd want to be looking for pressure. If the boats you're talking about multi-hulls that are faster than the wind, a lot of times you're looking ahead or to the sides instead of upwind for the new wind because you're sailing into the puffs. Hard to imagine, but that can and does happen. So pressure is king, minimizing the down speed. If the boats are faster than the wind, jibes are painful, and most maneuvers, because you're going 1/3 or less boat speed. So your VMG is really compromised in that. And the boats aren't sailing dead downwind. They're sailing at angles more like, upwind angles, 90-degree jibing angles or so, because of the speeds that they're going. The optimum VMG is found at higher boat speeds. Um, and one of the, okay, sorry.
So JB, this is going to tie into it. So we just got a question asking how you determine, what the VMG is to the mark. Like, what's the easiest way to figure that out? Are there calculations done? Is it eyeball? I mean, how do you really figure out, whether you're on an AC-45 versus a Tornado versus a whatever, how do you figure out what the right VMG is? Because, the difference between doing 15 knots at one angle or 12 and a half at another one, how do you really figure that out?
Well, I think it's pretty easy to calculate it and very difficult to execute. The more modern boats, I think, have, ability to have instruments that help you figure out the optimum VMG. Some boats have little tables that are built into the computer systems that have target angles and that, but those aren't always as accurate as you want because the wind and the waves and the physics of what's happening out there is always different. That's the beauty of sailing. It's never the same. So you can, if you sail the boat, if you have a boat and you're wanting to calculate your VMG, it would be trigonometry. You can ignore the leeway, but just sail, know what the wind direction is, the true wind direction, and sail the boat at certain angles and record your boat speed. And you can quickly calculate your speed dead downwind. And that's a little different if the mark is skewed, because VMG, we're talking about velocity made good. And when we're talking about it in a race course sense, we're generally talking about going dead upwind or dead downwind. And when the marks are skewed, sometimes you might want to, sail a little faster course. So not the optimum dead downwind VMG, but a little hotter angle or a little higher boat speed is sometimes an advantage. And then the other, I know the one thing planning the run that I don't want to steal Stan's thing, but knowing where the ley lines are, and in really fast boats, you want to set up the ley line so that you're above it enough so that you can take the sails down or get ready for the rounding. But the last thing you want to do is be sitting there trying to soak down to the mark, going lower than your optimum angle, and the other guys are coming flying in at twice your speed. So picking the ley line and trying not to be under the ley line, understood, meaning above and triangles are.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little more. We have a good drawing here and a video to talk about that. So Stan, talk about the lured gate or whatever, even if it's just a lured mark approach. I mean, there's, as JB is putting it, it's true. You want to be high enough that you can get the spinnaker or furled and put away. But if you're too high and you have to bear off, the boat will stop. It's kind of a funny thing, right? So if you can get into that, that would be a good one.
Well, I think JB is right that in general, when you're going to pick a ley line, if you're not sure, you want to err on the side of overstanding the ley line rather than understanding it, because you don't want to have to do more maneuvers at the bottom of the leg to compensate for the fact that you understood. However, depending on the kind of boat you're sailing, you need to build in enough wiggle room to be able to do the sail change that you may need to do, meaning take the spinnaker down. And if you're sailing a boat like a Marstrom 32 where the spinnaker is pretty flat and it furls up nice, it's not that hard to get those down. If you're sailing a Corsair 28, you're going to need, especially once there's wind, once you're sailing 10 or 12 knots or more, you're going to need several boat lengths to be able to bear away and head the boat dead downwind to unload the sail and be able to get it in. And the sail's got to be in the boat before you turn upwind, or it's not going to stay in the boat.
Well, and
It's going to be in the water.
The other thing this brings up is that I'm going to mention a couple of things here. Number one is to get out on the race course area early enough that you can start to figure out really where you think the race committee is going to set the marks up and get the lay of the land. Doing that, you find out what side of the course may have more pressure than the other. And you start to figure out angles with the waves, if there's any current, although current is less a factor the windier it is. But you also, if you have an idea in your own mind where the race committee is going to set up the course, and it helps to know the race committee and how they like to perform, then you can kind of start to sail the area and figure things out, almost sailing a phantom course before the race. So it helps you tremendously. And again, and this is one of those things that I've talked about for years, is if you can get out to your racing area 45 minutes or an hour before the race starts, you can get a ton of maneuver practice in. You can figure out the course. You can figure out the sailing conditions. Look at the clouds. Is there a front coming through? And all this other kind of stuff that all goes into the calculations that figure out your tactics and strategies. So it's, again, I say it again and again, and it's time to vote. I'm a big fan of that. I can't read stuff, but I can do stuff.
Totally makes sense.
That's a really good point, Brad. And I sailed on a Marstrom 32 for a couple of years, and we would get out as early as we could. And as soon as the race committee would have the marks in the water, we would go and try and sail the ley lines to the gate on both tacks, and then sight through the gate and try and get sights on land. So we would know where the ley lines were. Now, granted, the sights would move if the wind would go, would increase or decrease, but they were really important reference points for us. And the other thing that I would try to do was always call the ley line sitting in the same spot in the boat and sight through something that was fixed on the boat, so I be able to have as good an idea as what our exit angle is going to be, sighting through the shroud and seeing something on land. It's the same concept as using a hand-bearing compass, but it's not practical on a fast boat to pull out your hand-bearing compass. By the time it settles in, you needed a jibe.
Yeah. So you're setting up bearings and making notes and all that stuff. That's what you're doing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Stan, let's talk through this video here and point out a couple things that you've seen and you think are worth going through.
Great. So this is the same race we saw before, approaching the leeward mark. You'll see again the first two boats, they have nice clean roundings. They're able to get their gennikers down and they're away and free. What we see with this next two boats, and we're going to rewind this a couple times, we've got this leeward boat here that was trying to break this overlap, and they're not able to do it. And they just barely didn't do it, but we're going to see they pay a big penalty for this because they're going to end up having to round outside.
I can hear them now yelling at each other.
And then they're just in a bad spot, and they're either going to have to sail in bad air or tack away. And now we're going to see this group of four boats here.
Dan,
We'll see this boat that is the trailing boat of the four boats jibe away from the rest of the pack, and they're going to leap three boats because they're rounding the uncrowded mark.
Stan, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
On the third place boat, when those guys are coming in fighting for the overlap, what do you think the other guy should have done there?
Well, I mean, hindsight says they should have slowed down and round behind, right? And it's really a tricky call there because the boat jibed on top of them. They thought they were going to be able to sail through the wind shadow, and they just couldn't do it. But the safer thing would have probably been to slow down and round behind the other boat, which they would have had time to do at this point where we are in the frame.
So,
right?
so back up here again a little bit. But if you look at their wakes, all right, and you look at the third and the fourth place, look at the nice kind of smooth turn that the inside boat here made when he jibed, compared to kind of the bat turn that the outside boat. Yes, right, exactly. See the boat handling by virtue of the wakes. It just looks like the boat on the inside here made a smoother move, which helped him keep his speed up. And to me, that's what JB's been talking about. Boy, when you make a maneuver, you slow down as a huge percentage of your potential speed. So your maneuvers better be good.
It was a good jibe. It's the importance of boat handling.
Yeah.
If you jibe better than the other boats, then it's going to be a lot easier to pass them.
Yeah.
And again, with this outside boat, it's a tricky call there. And that's sailboat racing. With any tactical maneuver, there's some inherent risk. If they sail through that wind shadow, then they stay ahead of the boat.
So for me watching this, the two parts of this race that absolutely petrify me are bearing off at the windward mark and turning this leeward mark to go upwind, right? It seems like the two most difficult maneuvers you're going to do in this racetrack. So if the three of you could talk about this a little bit, from a practical standpoint and what's actually happening standpoint. You're approaching this leeward mark. Now you're furling the sail, the boat's slowing down, your apparent wind's changing. What's happening to the sails when you're doing that? And then all of a sudden now you're turning to go upwind. What happens to the sails then, right? Because we were talking before, you're going downwind, the faster you go, you're trimming tighter, and then you're pretty trimmed in, as we've seen in these photos. You're almost upwind trim, it seems like. Now all of a sudden you're turning it 90 degrees to go upwind. What's happening to the sails? It's not like, when I'm on my J22 and the main's all the way out and I know I trim it in. So if you guys could talk a little bit about practical what happens and in theory why you're doing it, I think I would go a long way.
I can do the theory side of things here. These guys, looking at this rounding, they're pretty good. They spend very little time, at a slower boat speed. I was, and what ends up happening on these leeward roundings is, as the boats furl the jibs, they slow down, and when they slow down, the apparent wind comes back. And when the apparent wind comes back and you don't ease your sails out, the sails can stall, but they also can heel the boat over. For these boats that are sailing faster than the wind, sort of the danger zone, and it depends on the wind speed, but it happens around 110 to 125 true wind angle, and it's like the line of death. And what happens is at the windward mark, as you bear off, until you get to that angle of about 120, your boat speed's picking up. So your apparent wind speed is picking up, but your apparent wind speed is also going aft as you're bearing off. And it isn't until you get to about 120 true wind angle that you start bearing off more and your apparent wind speed starts going down. So once you get to that angle, and it's about 120 true, it's like your safe zone. So around the leeward mark, it's a lot safer heading up because you're closer to the 120 going downwind. And once you get to that angle, you're kind of, as you bear up, the apparent wind angle is going forward. So you tend to be relieving the roll moment. But going downwind, bearing away from the top mark, it's the opposite. You have a long way to go before you get that relief of the roll moment. But that's, what the wind's doing. And practically, what do you do, Stan?
Yeah, just like you said, the boat slows down as the Jenniker is getting furled or doused. The sails got to go way out. And then when you're rounding the leeward mark, they got to come right back in again. So it's actually, it's a really athletic move for the crew. You kind of got to have all hands on deck getting the sails back in, because as soon as you've rounded the leeward mark, they don't want to be trimmed in instantly because you're accelerating again, but it's really pretty hard to get the sails in fast enough for how far they've been out.
But you do have to ease them out.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Short bit you get to, because your apparent wind goes back, so you just have to do that.
Super slow. Everything's going to stall.
Yeah. Being over trimmed is death.
Yeah. Yep.
Got it. So,
when in doubt.
And speaking of that, that's how you end up in this position, it seems like. So, we have a few questions that, I've come across, and maybe we'll just run right with this picture right here. So when you're in this position, like, what do you do? Or how do you even get out of it downwind? Or how do you avoid this?
Well, hold on, like these guys are. This boat actually didn't flip over either.
So even more reason to ask the question. So this boat right here doesn't flip over. So, what are you doing to not have it flip over?
Everything has been dumped at that point. And yeah, at this point, you're kind of hoping. Right. This is the point you don't want to get to. You got to trim the sails right, and you got to get through, especially when it's windy, through that angle that JB was talking about, that they call the death angle, and there's a good reason they call it that. So a lot of it's on the helmsman, really, to make sure that they're sailing the correct angle and that they're not heading up and powering the boat up when the crew's not ready to release the sails or trim them or whatever might be necessary.
Yeah.
So one of the questions that came through actually related to this a little bit is, how do you downwind determine what the heel angle should be? And, how do you manage that?
That depends on the boat. For most catamarans, ones that are light enough to fly a hull, flying the hull too high is not a good thing. You want to just get the hull out of the water and not fly it any higher. Because for most boats, if you're flying high, once the windward hull is out of the water, the leeward hull, the higher the hull flies, the leeward hull is displacing more water.
Starts to sink.
Got it.
Yeah.
That's a good point. One thing, Stan, that multi-hulls have the advantage of not heeling as much compared to a monohull, and that has a huge effect on the aerodynamics of the sail. So if you were imagining a boat sailing upwind, and it's not, and the more it heels, so you have the same true wind angle, so you're going the same direction to the wind, and then if you were to take that boat and heel it 90 degrees, but not have it hit the water, but just heel it over 90 degrees, and the boat is still facing the same way. What are the sails doing at that point?
Yeah.
They're flapping, right?
Yeah.
So it's like you take this boat here, it's sailing along, and now the sails are filled, and then if I heel it over 90 degrees, the sails are flapping. There's no apparent wind angle on the sails. So as the boats heel, your apparent wind angle's decreasing. And that's one of the reasons why the boats depower as they heel, because the wind angle gets tighter. And so the heeling, as it goes to a multi-hull, get the hull out of the water, but as Stan was saying, no higher. And that's one of the aerodynamics.
This is what the flying, and this is what the foiling moths and the kiteboards and stuff do as well, by changing the angle of attack of the wing, vertical over the water versus angled over the water, either spills air or holds air. So a vertical rig over the water, such as what you can get with a catamaran or a multi-hull, is ideal. But to reduce wetted surface and optimize your speed to get that windward hull just out of the water so it's just licking waves is going to be optimal, especially on the high-speed boats.
A good rule for a boat that can fly a hull is if the windward rudder is out of the water, then the hull's flying too high.
Yeah.
Got it.
Now, if you're sailing heavier multi-hulls that can't fly a hull, it is a little more tricky figuring out what your correct sailing angle should be downwind. And in a lot of ways, sailing the lighter boats, it's kind of a little bit easier to figure out what your correct angle is, because your telltale is your windward hull.
Well, if my Lagoon 42 guy is heeling his boat and his rudder's out of the water, it's probably the beef stew spilling down below and the piano tipping over. And it's not usually a highly recommended model of sailing.
No.
No. As soon as your significant other starts spilling their glass of wine, you got a problem, right?
It's time to go home.
Yeah, exactly. So I had two more questions that were directed to you guys before we call it a night. So the first one was actually for all three of you. So, each of you has a different role kind of in the multi-hull world. So, Stan from a high performance side, JB from a design and high performance side, and Brad, you're dealing with more of the cruising side.
Yep.
If each of you can kind of go through where you think multi-hull sailing is going and kind of what you think is the cool parts about it that's going to be coming up going forward here. I think people are curious about what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think that I'll just take quick bit here. I think that from the racing boats, the cruising boats are becoming much, much better. Understanding how the multi-hull concept works. There are a lot of great multi-hull cruising boats out there that are comfortable, but they don't sail very well. And more recently, the understanding of how these boats like to be sailed is being designed into the cruising boats, so they are more fun. And I think it's going to make a big difference. And I think it's going to, over the course of time, we'll see boats that sail much, much better, closer to the wind, and are fun downwind without the jeopardy of spilling the Cabernet and all that stuff. So that's where I see it going. Comfort is where it's at. People don't want to slam to weather for hours at a time.
Yeah, I think you're right, Brad. And I get excited about the multi-hull and what's happened, you know, the last decade or so, in that the boats have become lighter, faster, more innovative. They're more fun to sail. They're intriguing in their technology. And I see that kind of filtering into the cruising guy. I'd like to claim that the foiling boats are safe. They're not safe, you know, or relatively safe. You have to be on your toes. You have to pay attention and be aware of your environment, of what's going on. But I think through innovation and design and technology, we will get a handle on that and make those boats fill a wider group of sailing enthusiasts and bring into some of those attributes into the cruising or performance-oriented boats. You look at what's happened, you know, recently, how much more stable the boats are flying. Not so sure about the next America's Cup, but we'll see. But the technology is catching up, and hopefully the rules don't get in the way of good ideas. So it's pretty exciting times to be, you know, a performance sailor.
So I'm going to jump in, Stan, before you get in here with two more questions. So when we were talking about the heel angle, so one of the questions we just got is, if you're sailing a trimaran, is it fast to fly the actual main hull, or should you be cautious about flying the middle hull, you know, the main hull as well?
That's going to depend on the boat and how light it is, whether it's real. Some of them were designed to do that, and some of them weren't. I know
Exactly.
like the Sea Cart was supposed to fly the main hull, and it could do it real, and the floats were buoyant enough that you could do that. The Corsair trimarans were too heavy, and you would never be able to fly the main hull. So the answer was don't try. So it really does depend on the boat.
Right.
And like the TF10 that JB was talking about, I do some sailing on one of those. The boat foils downwind, but it doesn't really foil upwind. And the move upwind is to get most of the main hull not displacing water, but not to try to fly it, because you're chasing your tail and you're going to have to bear away too much.
Yeah. So Stan, I think you're right. The big point is, how is the boat designed? Because if the boat's designed to fly the main hull upwind, the floats will be designed to support the displacement of the boat. The worst thing you want is to overload the float, and it's creating more drag than having the main hull in. And then the other thing is what angle the floats are at. I mean, a lot of the multi-hulls, you know, for the ocean, they're designed to have, you know, the boat to have one hull is out of the water when the two hulls is in. So they're more sea kindly. So when they're in waves, the weather hull isn't slamming into the waves, and they put those up at an angle. Well, then that means you need more heel to get the main hull out of the water. So it's, you know, it's really about the design of the boat.
So another question for the three of you guys. There's quite a few people on this call who are, you know, they have trimarans, you know, they're not, or cats, and they're not really Marstrom 32s. They're not really Lagoon 42s, but they're, you know, your PHRF boats, you know, your Corsairs, your normal boats that, you know, people have. And some of the questions are, you know, for going downwind, A, do these same principles apply in terms of, you know, how to sail the boat? And B, you know, what are some of the sails you should use? One of the questions is a code 55 the right sail? What would a Jenniker on a boat like that look like? So I think the three of you can kind of maybe divvy this up. You know, Stan, talk a little bit about how you would sail downwind with these boats, and maybe if Brad and JB could talk about which sails you would lean on. But there's some questions about that for that PHRF type trimaran that, you know, they're out there.
You know, I used to do a lot of sailing on the Corsair 28 and a Corsair 31, and we actually had a pretty big inventory. And you know, for our VMG downwind sail, it was an A2 that was really big. And then we had a smaller one, a smaller spinnaker. I forget what we called that. And then we had what we called a screecher, which wasn't really like a code zero, but that was something we used for, you know, when we were doing more reaching and not necessarily, you know, not sailing downwind, maybe true wind angle when it was windy from like 90 to like 120 or 130 or something like that. And then we would start to carry our spinnakers when we were sailing lower than that. That is really boat specific. So if there are people that have specific questions about sail selection, then we can answer those via email also.
Yeah, I think that we touched on this earlier today when we were talking to you guys, that the older, heavier displacement designs, I would say appreciate the larger, older style Gennikers, and maybe you dip down into a code 0 or a code 65. If you've got a more current and a more high performance boat, then your two downwind sails, if you're going to have two, might be a code 65 and a code 55. Fact of the matter is, a lot of people sail around cracked off, you know, not fully on the breeze. And that's where the code sails make a ton of sense. But at the same time, the boat isn't performing really high enough to use a normal style, sort of older fashioned Genniker at that point, not until you bear off significantly more. And those are the boats that aren't necessarily sailing faster than the wind. They're sailing fast. They're sailing faster than a monohull, but they're not necessarily sailing faster than the wind, like JB's talking about with the AC 75, stuff like that. So I think the, you know, one question was from an old fashioned Newark 26 Tri. And yeah, it's an old fashioned boat. It's a relatively heavy boat. Fast for a today, but compared to these, you know, Marston's and stuff like that, it's a kind of a slow boat. So the more round downwind, so to speak, sails would be a little more appropriate for that guy. And again, it really depends on what your focus is on sailing.
Yeah.
What do you think, JB?
Yeah, I think, Brad, you're right. The one exciting thing, though, that's happened in sail making or sail design recently are these code sails. You know, some of the, as Stan's saying, you know, there is in these Corsairs and the Farriers that, you know, you need the big spinnaker at times. But I think that we've developed these code sails to fit this range, and they've come about mainly because the rules have allowed them. We've opened up the sail design rules where we had this zone due to sail rules that a spinnaker had to have a mid-girth of 75% of the foot, and a Genoa had to have a mid-girth less than 50% of the foot. And then you have this range of sails that was no man's land. No one was designing them, no one was using them, they were illegal to have. However, all the multi-hulls needed them. They needed a sail. They didn't want a big full spinnaker because they were going fast, and they wanted a flat, efficient sail that they could reduce the twist and trim in. And no one was building them, no one was designing them. So these new code sails like the tweeners and the code 65s and all that are sails that we always wanted to build, but we never really did because of the rule implications. So I think there's something here for these, you know, for these type of boats that would appreciate that type of sail, only performance and enjoyment of having a really efficient aerodynamic package for them.
Yeah.
So last question of the night here before we move on. So JB, this one's kind of directed more towards you, I think, is in how does 3DI sales really change the game for multi-hulls? I mean, was that a big advancement in the multi-hull world like it was everywhere else, or was it, you know, not that big of a deal? What was the...
Yeah, that's really an unfair question for me, because 3DI is a revolution. It's yet to seen its impact in sail making. It's really a game changer. We've had a game changer in the sense when we went from cotton to polyester sails. We had a game changer when we went from polyester to 3DL sails, Mylar molded sails. And we've had a game changer getting rid of the Mylar and having a full composite laminated sale in 3DI. These are game changers, and it's revolutionized the technology. I don't think in the 2013 America's Cup we would talk about how unbelievably stable the 3DI sails were on the AC-75, and we didn't think we could have made the sails to take those loads and be that flat. We were sailing around with jib cambers of 4.5%, 5%, mid cambers when, 3DL, we were having trouble to get 8% deep sail. So the technology is unbelievable, and the technology we have at our fingertips and that we as sailors and our customers have is really outstanding. And just look at some of those 3DI videos. Every time I go to the factories that we have that make the sails, I'm always like, wow, we get to use this stuff to make a sail? This is unbelievable.
Well, I would go so far. I generally talk about it this way. 3DI changing sails the way the big head tennis racket changed tennis, the way shape skis changed skiing, and the way the big club changed golf. It's just revolutionary. It's unbelievable. And the durability on top of that is incredible too. So it's a win-win-win thing for everybody.
Yeah, it's not only just the ultimate durability, it's also the shape holding, the racing competitive durability that you have in the sails.
We got a couple more questions, but I'll pass it on for you guys to answer directly. But we really appreciate that everyone spent an hour here with us tonight. We hope everyone out there is staying safe and they're through the time by thinking about sailing and working on their boats and thinking about their boats. But I really want to thank the three of these guys for their work tonight, JB, Stan, and Brad. Thank you for all your time here. And for all of you out there, if you have questions, if you have more comments, if you have another presentation that you want the three of these guys to do, send them emails. They're glad to do it, or they can talk to you individually about all these things. These webinars are going to be available after we're done. They're on YouTube, and they're also linked up through our social media and the North Sails webpage, so you'll be able to pick them up. Thank the three of you guys. It was really awesome. I know I learned a ton. I took some notes down. It's amazing. From someone who doesn't sail multi-hulls at all, I know very little about this stuff, especially on the middle or higher performance end. So thanks to the three of you guys. It was really awesome.
Thank you, Alan.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, JB. Thank you, Brad. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in.
All right.
We
Take care, everybody.
Thank
See
you
you on
guys.
the water.
Everybody have a good night. Stay safe, and we'll see you all soon.
Yes.
Great.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.